was a quiet black man in a simple suit, attending a wedding where no one knew who he truly was. He stood apart from the joyful chaos, a solitary figure observing the celebration with a calm, unreadable expression. The room was a symphony of celebration, a sea of pastel dresses and sharp tuxedos, but he remained an island of stillness. But when the bride, a vision in white, floated across the room and mocked him, her voice dripping with disdain, the delicate harmony of the evening shattered. She sneered that he looked lost, her words a sharp jab meant to wound. She then told him with a laugh that echoed with cruelty that he was just a guest. The room following her lead filled with a wave of uncomfortable, sycophantic laughter. The air grew thick with a shared, unspoken judgment. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that this quiet, unassuming man was Dr. Marcus Hale. He was not just any doctor. He was a world-renowned trauma surgeon, a man whose hands had pieced together life from the brink of death on battlefields across the globe. He was a hero, decorated for his bravery and skill by the U.S. Army general himself. Moments later, when a sudden, terrifying tragedy struck and the bride collapsed in the middle of her own celebration, every guest who had laughed would turn pale. Their faces would contort with a dawning, sickening horror as they realized the man she had so publicly and viciously humiliated was the only one in the entire glittering ballroom who could save her life. Before we find out what happens next, tell us, have you ever seen someone disrespect the wrong person? Drop your story in the comments, and if this one's already got your heart racing, hit that like button for more true justice moments like this. The grand ballroom of the Langford estate was a spectacle of deliberate opulence. Crystal chandeliers, each one the size of a small carriage, hung from the frescoed ceiling, casting a warm golden light upon the revelers below. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and champagne, a fragrant cloud that clung to the velvet drapes and polished marble floors. A string quartet played a soft, elegant melody in the corner, their music a gentle undercurrent to the lively hum of conversation and the delicate clinking of glasses. Guests mingled in small, shimmering groups, their laughter light and practiced, their smiles wide and bright. They were a collection of the city's elite, a carefully curated audience for the grand performance of Rebecca and Trent Langford's wedding day. Near the back of this magnificent room, partially obscured by a towering floral arrangement, stood Dr. Marcus Hale. He held a glass of sparkling water, the tiny bubbles rising in a silent, steady stream. He observed the scene with a quiet detachment, his gaze sweeping over the joyful crowd without lingering on any single face. He wore a simple, well-tailored navy suit, a stark contrast to the glittering gowns and bespoke tuxedos that surrounded him. It was a suit of quiet dignity, one that did not demand attention, and for that reason it seemed to draw it. He was not one of them, and it was obvious. He did not possess the easy, inherited confidence that permeated the room. His posture was straight, his shoulders broad, a silent testament to a life of discipline far removed from this world of inherited wealth and casual cruelty. He was an observer, a ghost at the feast, present only out of a long-held sense of duty to a man who was no longer there. Across the room, Rebecca Langford, the bride, was the undeniable center of this glittering universe. Her dress was a masterpiece of lace and silk, a cloud of white that seemed to glow under the chandelier's light. Her hair was swept up in an intricate arrangement of curls and pearls, and her smile, though dazzling, did not quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. She moved through her reception like a queen surveying her court, accepting compliments with a nod and a practiced, airy laugh. Her new husband, Trent, trailed in her wake, his own smile a little more genuine, a little more uncertain. He was a kind man, but his kindness was often overshadowed by his fiancée's powerful, domineering personality. He loved her, but he was also slightly afraid of her, a dynamic that many in the room understood and accepted as the natural order of things. Rebecca's eyes, sharp and critical, scanned her perfectly orchestrated event. They swept past the smiling faces of her friends, the nodding heads of her parents' business associates, and the deferential bows of the catering staff. Then her gaze landed on Marcus. A frown, small but distinct, creased her perfectly smooth forehead. She saw not a man, but an anomaly, a detail that was out of place in her perfect picture. His quiet presence, his simple suit, his dark skin, it all registered in her mind as an imperfection, a stain on her flawless day. She nudged one of her bridesmaids, a woman with a laugh as sharp as her painted nails. "Who is that?" Rebecca whispered, her voice a low hiss of disapproval. The bridesmaid followed her gaze and shrugged. "No idea. Maybe he's with the band?" The suggestion was enough. Rebecca's frown deepened into a sneer. She saw an opportunity, a chance to perform, to reinforce her own status by diminishing someone else's. With a theatrical sigh, she began to move towards him, her bridesmaids trailing behind her like a pack of loyal, vicious hounds. She approached him with a predatory grace, her silk dress rustling with each step. The small group of guests she passed fell silent, sensing the impending drama. They turned to watch, their faces a mixture of curiosity and cruel anticipation. A small circle cleared around Marcus as the bride came to a stop before him. "Excuse me," she began, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed, a voice that dripped with condescension. Marcus turned to face her, his expression calm, his eyes meeting hers without a flicker of intimidation. "Can I help you?" he asked, his own voice low and steady. Rebecca let out a short, sharp laugh. It was not a sound of amusement, but of ridicule. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at him, the diamond on her ring catching the light and flashing like a tiny, cruel star. "Who invited the help?" she asked, not to him, but to the audience of guests that had now gathered. Her friends giggled, the sound sharp and unpleasant. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the nearby circles of onlookers. Some looked away, their faces flushed with second-hand embarrassment, but no one spoke up. No one dared to challenge the bride on her day. Trent, who had finally caught up to her, looked mortified. "Rebecca, please," he whispered, his hand reaching for her arm. She shook him off, her eyes still locked on Marcus. She was enjoying this, the power she felt in this moment of public humiliation. She saw his dark suit and his quiet demeanor, and made a swift, brutal calculation. He was nobody. He was nothing. "You look a little lost," she continued, her voice syrupy sweet, but her words laced with venom. "This area is for guests. Are you a guest?" Marcus did not react. He did not flinch or frown. He simply held her gaze, his stillness a stark contrast to her agitated performance. "Yes," he said, his voice even. "I am." This simple, direct answer seemed to infuriate her even more. She wanted a reaction. She wanted him to shrink, to stammer, to apologize for his very existence. When he refused to give her that satisfaction, her cruelty escalated. "Oh, really?" she sneered, her lip curling. "Well, you're just a guest, right? So you should probably stay in your lane. Don't wander around like you own the place. The bar is over there and the exits are clearly marked." The laughter that followed this time was louder, more confident. Her friends, emboldened by her audacity, began to chime in, their voices a chorus of snide remarks. "Maybe he's looking for the kitchen," one of them giggled. "I think he made a wrong turn from the service entrance," another added. The air grew thick and heavy with their casual malice. Marcus stood in the center of it all, a silent pillar of composure. He absorbed their insults without a single visible crack in his calm facade. He looked at Rebecca, at the venom in her eyes, at the smug satisfaction on her face, and he felt not anger, but a profound and weary sadness. He had seen this kind of arrogance before in boardrooms and on battlefields. It was the hollow pride of those who had never been truly tested, who mistook privilege for strength. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "I understand," he said, his voice still quiet, but now carrying a weight that seemed to silence the giggles around him. I'm happy just being here." His words were simple, yet they held a power that Rebecca could not comprehend. He was not ashamed, he was not intimidated, he was simply present. The camera in the room of the mind's eye would have panned then across the sea of shocked and uncomfortable faces. It would have settled on Trent, whose face was pale with a mixture of shame and helplessness. It would have zoomed in on the wedding planner, Natalie, who stood by the grand entrance, her expression one of deep and profound disgust. She watched as Marcus, with his dignity not only intact but somehow magnified by the assault, gave a small, polite nod. He then quietly excused himself, melting back into the shadows of the grand ballroom. He left Rebecca standing in the spotlight she had created, basking in the shallow, hollow laughter of her friends. The tension he left behind, however, was a palpable thing. It lingered in the air, a sour note in the symphony of celebration, a quiet promise of a reckoning to come. Marcus stepped through the ornate French doors and onto the stone terrace. The cool night air was a welcome relief, a clean slate after the stifling atmosphere of the ballroom. He walked to the edge of the balustrade and looked out over the manicured gardens. The perfect rows of roses and the precisely trimmed hedges bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. He took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine filling his lungs. He was not angry. He was not hurt. He was a man who had faced down death itself, who had held the fragile thread of life in his hands more times than he could count. The petty cruelties of a spoiled bride were like stones thrown into a vast, deep ocean. They made a small splash and were gone, swallowed by the immense quiet depths of his experience. He closed his eyes, and for a moment the sounds of the wedding, the music, the laughter, the clinking glasses, faded away. They were replaced by other, more familiar sounds. The frantic whir of a helicopter's blades, the urgent shouts of medics in a field hospital, the low, pained moans of wounded soldiers. The image of the grand ballroom dissolved, replaced by a canvas tent. The air thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp antiseptic smell of sterile gauze. These were the flashbacks that defined him, the memories that had forged the calm, unshakable man who stood on the terrace. He was not just Marcus Hale, the quiet guest in the simple suit. He was Dr. Marcus Hale, the chief of trauma surgery at St. Augustine Medical Center, one of the most respected and skilled surgeons in the country. He saw his hands not holding a glass of water, but gloved and steady, working with lightning speed and precision to stop a bleed, to repair a shattered bone, to restart a failing heart. He saw the faces of the young men and women he had saved, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude. He remembered the weight of the medal placed around his neck, the cool, heavy metal a stark contrast to the warmth of the U.S. Army general's hand on his shoulder. He remembered the words spoken that day, not about his status or his wealth, but about his service, his courage, his unwavering commitment to preserving human life. That was his identity. That was his truth. The mockery he had just endured felt distant and insignificant in the face of these powerful, life-altering memories. He was here tonight, not as a surgeon, not as a decorated hero, but as a friend. He was here to honor a promise he had made to a dying man. Trent's father, a kind and gentle soul named Arthur Langford, had been his patient years ago. Arthur had come to him with a condition that other doctors had deemed hopeless. Marcus had fought for him, had used every ounce of his skill and knowledge to give him a few more precious years with his family. During that time, they had become friends. They had spoken not of medicine, but of life, of family, of hopes and fears. Arthur had often spoken of his son, Trent, with a mixture of love and concern. "He's a good boy, Marcus," Arthur had said, his voice weak but his eyes clear. "But he's too easily swayed. He lets that girl, Rebecca, walk all over him. Promise me you'll look out for him, just a little." Marcus had promised. And so, when the wedding invitation had arrived, addressed to Mr. Marcus Hale, he knew he had to attend. He had deliberately chosen not to use his title. He didn't want to overshadow the couple on their special day. He didn't want to be Dr. Hale, the celebrated surgeon. He just wanted to be Marcus, a quiet guest, a silent observer honoring the memory of a friend. He wanted to see for himself that Trent was happy, that he was safe. He had seen enough tonight to know that Arthur's worries had been well-founded. He had seen the weakness in Trent's eyes, the way he had stood by silent and helpless, while his bride publicly humiliated a guest. He had seen the casual cruelty in Rebecca's smile, and a quiet, paternal sense of concern for the young man settled in his heart. A soft footstep on the stone behind him brought him back to the present. He turned to see the wedding planner, Natalie Rivera, standing in the doorway. She held a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and her face was etched with a deep, sincere apology. "I am so sorry about that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What she did was unforgivable." Marcus offered her a small, reassuring smile. It was a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that radiated a genuine and profound sense of peace. "It's all right," he said. "Don't trouble yourself over it." Natalie stepped closer, her brow furrowed with a mixture of confusion and admiration. "How can you be so calm?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. "She treated you like you were nothing. She was cruel." Marcus turned his gaze back to the moonlit garden. He thought for a moment before he spoke, choosing his words with the same care and precision he used in the operating room. "In my line of work," he began, his voice low and thoughtful, "you learn to see people for who they are, not for the masks they wear. You see them when they are at their most vulnerable, when all the pretense and pride has been stripped away." He paused, then looked back at Natalie, his eyes holding a deep, ancient wisdom. "People reveal their true selves most quickly when they think you're beneath them," he said. "She didn't humiliate me tonight, she only revealed herself." Natalie stared at him, his words hanging in the cool night air between them. She had never met anyone like him before. His grace, his dignity, his quiet strength. It was a powerful and humbling thing to witness. The narrator's voice would have then descended upon the scene, a low and knowing whisper. It would have spoken of destiny and fate, of how this single, quiet moment of grace, this small act of turning the other cheek, was not an end, but a beginning. It was the setup for a dramatic and inevitable turn of events, a quiet moment of foreshadowing before the universe itself would step in to deliver a powerful and unforgettable lesson in humility. Inside the grand ballroom, the party continued, its glittering facade carefully pasted back into place. But for Natalie Rivera, the magic of the evening had been irrevocably shattered. The scene on the terrace replayed in her mind on a loop, a stark and vivid contrast. She saw Rebecca's sneering face, twisted with an ugly, unearned sense of superiority. She heard the cruel, cutting words, the sycophantic laughter of her friends. And then she saw Marcus. She saw the quiet dignity in his posture, the profound calm in his eyes, the gentle, forgiving smile he had offered in the face of such blatant disrespect. The injustice of it all settled deep in her soul, a cold, hard knot of anger and frustration. She was just the planner. Her job was to remain invisible, to ensure the smooth, seamless execution of the event, to cater to the bride's every whim, no matter how unreasonable. To speak up, to confront Rebecca, would be professional suicide. She would be fired on the spot, her reputation tarnished, her small business left in ruins. The Langfords were a powerful family, and their reach was long. But to remain silent felt like a betrayal of her own conscience. It felt like complicity. She watched Rebecca from across the room, now holding court near the towering wedding cake, laughing and preening for a circle of admirers. The sight of her made Natalie's stomach churn. She knew she could not challenge the bride directly. Not here. Not now. But she could be prepared. She could be vigilant. A new resolve hardened within her. She slipped her phone from the pocket of her tailored black dress, its screen a small, bright beacon in the dimly lit corner where she stood. With a few quick taps, she opened the voice recording. Tap. It was a small act of rebellion, a quiet gathering of evidence. She didn't know why she was doing it, not exactly. Perhaps it was for her own peace of mind, a way to validate the ugliness she had witnessed. Or perhaps on some deeper, more intuitive level, she sensed that this night was not yet over, that the universe had not yet finished writing its final chapter. From that moment on, she kept the phone discreetly in her hand, the microphone silently capturing the ambient sounds of the reception, ready to document any further displays of the bride's venomous character. Her curiosity about the quiet, dignified man in the navy suit had now become a burning obsession. Who was he? What was his story? How could he possess such grace under fire? Later, during a brief lull in her duties while the guests were being served their main course, she slipped into her small, temporary office just off the main hall. She sat down at her laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating her determined face. She typed his name, Marcus Hale, into the search bar. She didn't expect to find much. Perhaps a social media profile, a business listing. What she found instead made her jaw drop. The first result was a link to the St. Augustine Medical Center's website. The page that loaded showed a picture of the same man she had just spoken to on the terrace. But here, he was not in a simple suit. He was wearing blue surgical scrubs, a stethoscope draped around his neck, his expression serious and focused. The title beneath his name read, Dr. Marcus Hale, Chief of Trauma Surgery. Natalie's hand flew to her mouth, a gasp escaping her lips. He was a doctor, a chief of surgery. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost suffocating. Rebecca had mocked him, had called him the help, had treated him as if he were less than human, and all the while he was one of the most respected and important figures in the city's medical community. But it was the next search result that truly took her breath away. It was a news article from a national publication, the headline written in bold, stark letters. Dr. Marcus Hale receives Medal of Honor for saving 48 lives in combat zone. The article was accompanied by a photograph. It showed Marcus, this time in a decorated military dress uniform, standing tall and proud as a 4-star general, pinned a medal to his chest. She read the article with wide, disbelieving eyes. It detailed his heroic actions during an overseas deployment, how he had worked for 36 hours straight in a makeshift field hospital under constant enemy fire to save the lives of dozens of critically wounded soldiers. It spoke of his courage, his skill, his unwavering dedication to his duty. Natalie leaned back in her chair, the phone in her hand suddenly feeling heavier, more significant. The color drained from her face. She whispered the words to the empty room, her voice trembling with the force of her revelation. She mocked a hero. She quickly saved the link to the article. She took a screenshot of the photo of Marcus with the general. She saved his professional bio from the hospital website. She didn't know how or when this information would be needed, but she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that it would matter. She knew that the story of this night was far from over, and she was now a keeper of its most explosive secret. The wedding planner had become a witness, and the witness was now armed with the truth. Rebecca, oblivious to the storm of truth gathering just beyond the ballroom doors, continued to revel in her role as the radiant, adored bride. She was the sun, and everyone else was a planet, expected to orbit around her in silent, grateful admiration. Her arrogance was a tangible thing, a suffocating perfume that filled the air around her. She drifted from table to table, not to thank her guests for coming, but to hold them captive with long, rambling stories about her expensive dress, her extravagant honeymoon plans, and the sheer, unadulterated perfection of her life. She spoke of the 5-star resort in Bora Bora where they would be staying, describing the overwater bungalow in excruciating detail, her voice laced with a smug satisfaction that made even her closest friends exchange weary, knowing glances. She dismissed the catering staff with a flick of her wrist, her words sharp and impatient. When the band took a brief, much-needed break, she snapped at a young waiter who had brought her a glass of champagne from a different bottle than the one she preferred. "Are you deaf?" she asked, her voice high and shrill. "I said I only drink the Grand Reserve. This tastes like cheap vinegar. Take it away and bring me what I asked for." The waiter, a young man no older than 20, flushed a deep, painful red. He stammered an apology and scurried away, his shoulders slumped in humiliation. Trent, standing beside her, looked deeply uncomfortable. "Becca, he's just a kid," he murmured. his voice low. "Don't be so hard on him." Rebecca turned on him, her eyes flashing with a cold fire. "Don't you dare tell me how to act, Trent," she hissed. "This is my day. Everything has to be perfect, and that includes not having incompetent staff serving swill." Her voice was low, but her venom was potent. Trent shrank back, his brief flicker of defiance extinguished. He was a man who had chosen the path of least resistance, and that path was paved with his fiancée's unchecked pride. Later, as she was directing the photographer for another series of posed, joyless pictures, she spotted Marcus again. He was standing near the far wall, speaking quietly with an elderly couple, friends of Trent's late father. The sight of him, his calm and unobtrusive presence, seemed to ignite her rage all over again. She leaned into Trent, her voice a poisonous whisper in his ear. "We can't let random people like that guy ruin our photos," she said, her words a clear and deliberate echo of her earlier insults. "He just looks so out of place. It's dragging down the whole aesthetic." Trent winced, but he said nothing. He simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. He knew it was wrong. A part of him, the part that still remembered his father's lessons about kindness and respect, screamed in protest. But the part of him that feared his new wife's wrath was stronger. Natalie, who was nearby coordinating the cake-cutting ceremony, overheard the entire exchange. Her heart ached for Trent's weakness, but her anger at Rebecca solidified into a cold, hard diamond of contempt. The bride's cruelty was not a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a fundamental part of her character, a deep and rotten core beneath the beautiful, expensive surface. The final confirmation of this came from Rebecca's own mother, a woman who was a slightly older, more weathered version of her daughter. She had been standing nearby and had also overheard the comment. She patted Rebecca's arm, a proud, conspiratorial smile on her face. "You're right, dear," she said, her voice dripping with the same casual disdain as her daughter's. "You have to be careful about the kind of people you allow into your circle. People like that simply don't belong in our world." The words hung in the air, a final damning testament to a lifetime of learned prejudice and unearned superiority. The narrator's voice would have then returned, its tone now heavy with a sense of impending doom. It would have spoken of the ancient, universal laws of pride and consequence. It would have whispered that arrogance has a way of tempting fate, of sending out an invitation to the universe for a sudden and violent storm. And on this night, in this grand and glittering ballroom, the storm was about to arrive. The moment came, as such moments often do, when the celebration was at its peak. The band had returned to the stage, their music now a lively, upbeat rhythm that seemed to inject a new wave of energy into the room. The cake had been cut, the toasts had been made, and the champagne was flowing freely. It was time for the first dance, the romantic centerpiece of the entire evening. Trent led Rebecca to the center of the polished dance floor, a single spotlight illuminating them in a pool of warm white light. The first notes of their chosen song, a slow and sentimental ballad, filled the air. Trent placed a hand on Rebecca's waist, and she draped her arms around his neck. They began to sway, a picture of perfect romantic bliss. For a few moments, everything was as it should be. Rebecca smiled up at her new husband, the picture of a radiant, happy bride. The guests watched, their faces soft with romantic sentimentality. But then, about halfway through the song, the perfect picture began to fracture. Rebecca's smile faltered. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a slight, almost imperceptible wavering at the corners of her mouth. She blinked, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. Trent, lost in the moment, didn't notice at first. "What's wrong?" he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "Nothing," she whispered back, but her voice was strained, breathless. She tried to smile again, to recapture the moment, but the smile wouldn't hold. Her hand, which had been resting lightly on Trent's shoulder, suddenly gripped his jacket with a desperate, white-knuckled strength. She took a sharp, gasping breath, as if the air had suddenly become too thick to inhale. Her other hand went to her chest, clutching at the delicate lace of her gown. Panic, stark and terrifying, began to ripple across the dance floor. The guests closest to the couple saw the change in her expression, the sudden, unnatural stiffness in her body. The soft, sentimental mood of the room began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, creeping sense of dread. "Rebecca?" Trent asked, his voice now laced with a dawning alarm. "Honey, are you okay?" She couldn't answer. Her mouth opened, but only a small, choked sound came out. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and confusion, were locked on his. Then her body went limp. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she began to collapse, a dead weight in her husband's arms. He tried to hold her, to catch her, but she was too heavy, her fall too sudden. She slipped from his grasp and hit the polished marble floor with a sickening final thud. For a single frozen moment, there was a stunned, absolute silence. The band trailed off, the last note of the love song hanging in the air like a question mark. The guests stared, their minds unable to process what they had just seen. The beautiful, perfect bride was lying in a crumpled heap of white silk on the dance floor, as still as a fallen statue. And then the silence shattered. A woman screamed, a high, piercing sound that broke the spell. The scream was a spark that ignited a wildfire of panic. The room erupted into chaos. People gasped, they shouted, they surged forward, a wave of horrified, helpless onlookers. Trent dropped to his knees beside his wife, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. "Rebecca!" he yelled, his voice cracking. He shook her gently, then harder, but there was no response. Her eyes were closed, her face a pale, waxy white against the dark floor. "Someone call 911!" a man's voice boomed from the back of the room. A frantic fumbling for phones began, a cascade of panicked voices all trying to speak at once. The staff rushed forward, adding to the confusion. No one knew what to do. They were a room full of wealthy, powerful, important people. But in the face of this sudden, stark medical emergency, they were all equally, utterly useless. They stared, they pointed, they screamed, they cried, but no one moved to help. Until one man did. From the edge of the room, Marcus Hale stepped forward. He moved with a calm, deliberate purpose that cut through the chaos, like a knife. His face was a mask of intense focus, his eyes already assessing the situation with the practiced, lightning-fast efficiency of a seasoned trauma surgeon. "Clear the area," he said. His voice was not loud, but it was firm, imbued with an authority that was impossible to ignore. A few people turned to look at him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "Who is he?" someone muttered. "What does he think he's doing?" But Marcus was already moving, his strides long and confident. He reached the edge of the panicked circle that had formed around Rebecca. "I said, clear the area," he repeated, his voice sharper this time, louder. "Now!" There was something in his tone, a raw, undeniable command that resonated on a primal level. It was the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed in moments of life and death, and it worked. The crowd, desperate for someone, anyone to take charge, instinctively parted. They stumbled back, creating a clear path to the fallen bride. Within seconds, Marcus was kneeling at her side, his fingers immediately going to her neck, searching for a pulse. The room held its breath, waiting. The air in the ballroom was thick with a mixture of perfume, panic, and a rising collective sense of shock. Marcus's fingers pressed against Rebecca's carotid artery, his touch firm and practiced. He felt for a beat, a flutter, any sign of life. Nothing. Her skin was cool and clammy. He leaned down, his ear close to her mouth, listening for the sound of breath. Silence. Her chest was perfectly still. His face, already a mask of intense concentration, hardened. He knew with a certainty that sent a cold spike of adrenaline through his veins, that every second was now a precious, irreplaceable currency. He looked up at Trent, whose face was a ghostly white, his eyes wide with a helpless, pleading terror. "She's not breathing," Marcus said, his voice stripped of all emotion, leaving only the cold, hard facts. "She's in cardiac arrest." The words landed like a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Rebecca's mother, who had pushed her way to the front of the crowd, let out a heart-wrenching sob, but Marcus had no time for grief or panic. His training took over, his mind and body moving in a seamless, practiced rhythm. He needed to get to her chest. He needed to start compressions. The bride's dress, a magnificent constricting cage of silk and boning, was in the way. Without a moment's hesitation, he grabbed the bodice of the expensive gown, his strong hands finding the seam. With a single, powerful motion, he ripped the fabric open, tearing through the delicate lace and intricate beadwork. The sound of tearing silk echoed through the silent ballroom. More gasps. Some of the guests looked offended, their sense of propriety momentarily overriding their sense of alarm. The desecration of the beautiful, expensive dress seemed to them a violation in itself. But Marcus was oblivious to their reactions. He had a single, all-consuming purpose: to save the life of the woman in front of him. With her chest now accessible, he placed the heel of one hand on her sternum, laced the fingers of his other hand over the top, and began chest compressions. He pushed hard and fast, his arms a piston of focused energy, his body a metronome counting out the rhythm of life. 1, 2, 3, 4, he counted under his breath, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of chaos around him. He looked up, his eyes scanning the sea of frozen faces, until he found Trent. "You," he commanded, his voice sharp. "Hold her head, tilt it back. Keep her airway open." Trent, jolted out of his stupor by the direct order, scrambled to obey, his hands trembling as he gently cradled his wife's head. Marcus's gaze then darted to Natalie, the planner, who was standing nearby, her face pale but her eyes clear and focused. "You, get me towels, and find the venue's first aid kit. I need a pocket mask if they have one." Natalie didn't hesitate. She simply nodded and disappeared into the crowd, her professional instincts kicking in, grateful for a task, for a way to be useful. Just as a rhythm was being established, a new voice, shrill and hysterical, pierced the tense silence. It was Rebecca's mother. She lunged forward, her face contorted with a mixture of grief and rage. "Get your hands off of her!" she screamed, her eyes wild. "Who are you? Who do you think you are to touch my daughter?" She tried to push him away, to claw at his arms, but one of the groomsmen caught her, holding her back as she struggled and sobbed. Marcus did not stop the compressions. He did not even look at her. His focus was absolute, his concentration unbreakable. He simply responded, his voice a low, powerful growl that cut through her hysteria and silenced the entire room. "I'm the only thing between her and death." The words landed with the force of a physical blow. A profound, stunned silence fell over the ballroom. The reality of the situation, stark and terrifying, finally settled over the crowd. This was not a moment for propriety or prejudice. This was a moment of life and death, and the quiet, unassuming man in the navy suit, the man they had allowed the bride to mock and humiliate, was now the single, solitary commander in that battle. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds in the room were Marcus's grunted breaths, the steady, rhythmic pressure of his hands on Rebecca's chest, and the ragged sobs of her mother. Then a new sound emerged from the distance, the wail of an approaching siren. A wave of collective relief washed over the guests. The professionals were here. Help had arrived. 2 paramedics burst through the ballroom doors, their movements swift and efficient. They pushed a gurney and carried a defibrillator and an oxygen tank. "Clear a path," the first paramedic shouted, his eyes scanning the scene. He saw Marcus on the floor performing perfect deep compressions. He saw the torn dress, the pale bride, the terrified groom. He and his partner rushed to Marcus's side, ready to take over. The first paramedic knelt down, preparing to place the defibrillator pads. He looked up at Marcus's face, ready to get a report. And then he froze. His eyes widened, a look of utter disbelieving recognition dawning on his face. "Dr. Hale?" he blurted out, his voice a mixture of shock and reverence. The other paramedic looked up, his own expression mirroring his partner's. Marcus didn't break his rhythm. He just grunted in acknowledgement. But the first paramedic couldn't contain his astonishment. "Sir," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It's me, Corporal Jensen. You saved my entire unit overseas, in Kandahar. I never thought I'd see you again." In that moment, time seemed to stop. Every guest, every staff member, every single person in that room heard those words. Dr. Hale saved my unit overseas. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with an audible, shattering clang. The quiet guest, the decorated hero, the world-renowned surgeon. A wave of silent, horrified realization washed over the crowd. They looked from the paramedic's awestruck face to Marcus's grimly determined one. They remembered Rebecca's sneering words, their own complicit laughter, and a deep, profound shame, cold and heavy, began to settle in their hearts. Natalie, who had returned with the first aid kit, had her phone in her hand. Her thumb, almost of its own accord, had pressed the record button the moment the paramedics had recognized him. She captured it all, the shock, the reverence, the dawning horror on the faces of the guests. She captured the moment the truth was finally, irrevocably revealed. The transition from the opulent ballroom to the sterile, brightly lit chaos of the hospital emergency room was jarring. The paramedics, now working under Marcus's calm and direct command, moved with a renewed sense of urgency and precision. They had a living legend in their midst, and they were not going to fail him. Marcus never left Rebecca's side. He rode in the ambulance, directing her care, calling out orders, his mind a steel trap of medical knowledge and emergency protocols. At the hospital, the emergency team was already assembled, alerted to the high-profile patient who was en route. When the gurney burst through the doors with Marcus Hale, their own chief of trauma surgery, directing the resuscitation, a wave of stunned silence rippled through the ER staff before they snapped into action, their movements sharpened by his commanding presence. He was a whirlwind of controlled, efficient energy. He directed the placement of IV lines, ordered medications, and interpreted the frantic beeps and squiggles on the heart monitor with a calm, practiced eye. He was no longer the quiet guest, he was the master of this domain, a conductor orchestrating a symphony of life-saving measures. He worked with a deep, impersonal focus, his hands and mind dedicated to the intricate machinery of the human body before him. The patient's identity, her earlier cruelty, her very name, all of it was irrelevant. She was a life hanging in the balance, and his sole duty was to tip the scales back from the edge of oblivion. After what felt like an eternity of tense, focused activity, a steady, regular rhythm finally appeared on the monitor. A collective, relieved sigh went through the emergency room team. Rebecca was stabilized. She was alive. The immediate crisis was over. As Marcus stepped out of the trauma bay, stripping off his gloves, the full chaos of the situation outside the medical bubble hit him. The hospital waiting room was already swarming. Reporters and news vans had begun to arrive, their cameras and microphones creating a frantic, jostling mob near the entrance. The story was simply too sensational to ignore. A high society bride collapses at her own wedding, only to be saved by a mystery guest who turns out to be a famous war hero surgeon. It was a headline written in tabloid heaven. One of the paramedics, in his awestruck excitement, had leaked the story to a friend in the local news, and it had spread like wildfire. Trent was sitting on a cold plastic chair in a small private waiting area just outside the ICU. His head was in his hands, his expensive tuxedo now rumpled and stained. He looked pale and utterly broken, the polished veneer of his wealthy upbringing stripped away to reveal a young man lost in a sea of shock and shame. Natalie stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, a silent, steady presence in the whirlwind of chaos. She had followed the ambulance to the hospital, feeling an unspoken duty to see this through, to bear witness to the final act of this incredible drama. She saw Marcus emerge and walked over to him, her expression a mixture of awe and gratitude. "I don't know what to say," she began, her voice low. "Thank you. What you did back there, after what she said to you, I've never seen anything like it." Marcus looked at her, his eyes weary, but his expression kind. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving a deep, bone-aching exhaustion in its wake. He ran a hand over his face, the weight of the night finally settling onto his broad shoulders. "A life is a life," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It doesn't matter who it belongs to. Respect, or the lack of it, should never be a condition for compassion. That's the first thing they teach you. It's the first thing you have to teach yourself." Trent, who had been lost in his own world of misery, overheard these words. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes meeting Marcus's. The full weight of his own failure, his own cowardice, crashed down upon him. He had stood by and watched his bride humiliate this man, this incredible, heroic man, and then he had stood by and watched that same man save her life, without a moment's hesitation, without a single flicker of resentment. A wave of shame so profound it was physically painful flooded his face. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, but no words came out. What could he possibly say that would be adequate? Meanwhile, in another part of the hospital, Rebecca's family was already in damage control mode. Her mother and father, their faces grim, were huddled in a corner, speaking in hushed, urgent tones on their cell phones. They were not calling family members to update them on their daughter's condition. They were calling their publicist, their lawyer. They were scrambling to spin the story, to control the narrative, to somehow salvage their family's reputation from the impending disaster. But it was already too late. The story was no longer theirs to control. In the chaotic waiting room, a teenager with a smartphone had discovered a video that was just starting to go viral. It was Natalie's video. It showed the moment the paramedic recognized Dr. Hale, the dawning shock on the guests' faces. And someone else, another guest, had already posted a shaky cell phone video of the initial confrontation, of Rebecca's cruel, mocking words. The two clips were being shared, edited together, and uploaded across every social media platform. The internet, in its swift and unforgiving judgment, was already telling the world the true story of what had happened in that glittering ballroom. The digital world moves at the speed of light, and the story of Dr. Marcus Hale and Rebecca Langford was a supernova, exploding across the internet with a blinding, ferocious intensity. Natalie's video, clear and damning, was the spark. It was paired with the earlier clip of Rebecca's mockery, creating a narrative so compelling, so perfectly structured with a villain and a hero that it was irresistible. It was a modern-day parable served up in a 60-second clip, and the world was hungry for it. Within hours, hashtags were trending. #respect everyone. #Dr. Hale the hero. #Bridezilla down. Millions of people watched the videos, their reactions a tidal wave of outrage and admiration. Memes were created. Rebecca's sneering face was plastered next to Marcus's calm, dignified expression. Her words, "You're just a guest," became a symbol of arrogance and ignorance. His quiet response, "I'm happy just being here," became a mantra of grace under pressure. The story transcended local news and went global. Talk shows scrambled to book interviews. Pundits and commentators dissected the events, holding them up as a powerful lesson on class, race, and the true meaning of character. Marcus was lauded as a national hero, not just for his medical skills, but for his profound humility. He was the embodiment of honor, a man who had faced down disrespect with a quiet strength that was more powerful than any angry retort. Rebecca, on the other hand, became the face of public regret, a cautionary tale for the ages. She was the villain in a story she had written herself, and the entire world was now reading the final, humiliating chapter. Inside the quiet, sterile room of the hospital's cardiac care unit, Rebecca slowly opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was the blurry white ceiling. The first thing she heard was the soft, rhythmic beeping of the machine beside her bed. A dull ache throbbed in her chest. Her mind was a fog, a confusing jumble of fragmented memories. The music, the dance, Trent's smiling face. And then, a sharp, crushing pain, a feeling of falling. And then, nothing. She turned her head, her movements slow and weak. Her mother was sitting in a chair by the window, her face pale and drawn. A television mounted on the wall was on, the volume turned down low, but the images were clear. It was a news report, and it was about her. She saw a picture of her own wedding, then a shaky video of her collapsing on the dance floor. She saw images of the hospital, of reporters clamoring for a story. And then, she saw a photo of a man, a quiet, dark-skinned man in a simple navy suit. The man she had mocked. The man she had humiliated. The news anchor was speaking, her words inaudible but her expression serious. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Hero doctor saves bride, who humiliated him." A cold, sickening dread began to seep into Rebecca's bones, a dread that was far more terrifying than the memory of the pain in her chest. She looked at her mother, her own eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice a dry, raspy croak. Her mother couldn't meet her gaze. She just stared at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. Rebecca asked again, her voice a little stronger this time, laced with a growing panic. "Who was that man? The one on the news?" And then the question that she was most afraid to ask, the question to which she already knew the answer. Did he really save me?" Her mother could only nod, a single slow, devastating movement. She finally looked up, her own eyes filled with a mixture of pity and despair. "Yes," she whispered. "He saved your life." Rebecca turned her face away, staring at the blank wall beside her bed. The full, crushing weight of her actions, of her own public, spectacular downfall, settled upon her. It was not relief she felt. It was not gratitude. It was a profound and searing humiliation, a shame so deep it felt like it was physically consuming her. Tears, hot and silent, began to form in the corners of her eyes and trail down her temples into her perfectly styled hair. She had orchestrated her perfect day, and in a single, careless act of cruelty, she had turned it into her own personal, globally televised nightmare. Marcus left the hospital through a back exit, hoping to avoid the burgeoning media circus at the front. He was emotionally and physically drained, the adrenaline having long since worn off, leaving behind a profound weariness. All he wanted was to go home, to sit in the quiet of his own apartment, to let the silence wash away the noise of the last few hours. As he slid into the driver's seat of his unassuming sedan, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the caller ID, and a rare, small smile touched his lips. It was General Howard Monroe, his old commanding officer, his mentor, his friend. He answered the call. "Marcus," the general's voice boomed through the speaker, as warm and commanding as Marcus remembered it. "I've been seeing you all over the news, son. It seems you're still in the business of running into burning buildings." Marcus let out a tired chuckle. "Something like that, sir. It wasn't exactly my plan for the evening." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when the general spoke again, his voice was softer, filled with a deep, paternal pride. "I saw the whole story, Marcus. I saw what that woman said to you, and I saw what you did for her." He paused again, his voice thick with emotion. "Son, you just reminded this entire country what true honor looks like. It's not about the uniform you wear or the medals on your chest. It's about how you act when no one is looking. It's about how you treat people who have given you every reason to treat them with contempt." Marcus was silent, humbled by the praise from the man he respected more than anyone in the world. "I was just doing my job, General," he said quietly. "No, son," Monroe corrected him. "You were doing more than your job. You were teaching a master class in grace, and that's a lesson this country sorely needs right now." The general's voice became firm again, filled with a new sense of purpose. "And that's why I'm not going to let this moment pass. I'm going to hold a public ceremony. I want to recognize you again, not for what you did on the battlefield, but for what you did in that ballroom. This time, I want the whole world to see it. I want them to see what a real hero looks like." Marcus hesitated. The thought of more cameras, more attention, more publicity was exhausting. He had no desire for fame or accolades. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't think that's necessary," he began. But the general cut him off. "It is necessary, Marcus. It's necessary because people need to be reminded of what's important." Marcus thought for a moment. He thought about Rebecca's sneering face. He thought about the laughter of the guests. He thought about the countless small daily indignities that people who looked like him endured in rooms just like that one. And he realized the general was right. This wasn't about him. It was about something bigger. "All right, sir," he said, his voice now firm with a renewed sense of resolve. "I'll do it." He took a deep breath. "Maybe this time it'll teach people to see beyond the color of a man's skin or the simplicity of his suit. Maybe it will teach them to see the content of his character." 1 week later, the auditorium of St. Augustine Medical Center was filled to capacity. It was an unusual mix of people. There were doctors and nurses in their scrubs and lab coats, hospital administrators in their sharp business suits, and decorated military personnel in their crisp dress uniforms. And in between them there were reporters, cameramen, and television producers, their equipment creating a nest of cables and lights in the aisles. A stage had been set up at the front of the room, adorned with an American flag and the hospital's official banner. The event was being broadcast live on every major news network. The nation was still captivated by the story, and this ceremony was its eagerly awaited final chapter. General Howard Monroe, a man who radiated authority and integrity, stood at the podium. His voice, strong and clear, filled the auditorium. He spoke of Marcus's service, his skill as a surgeon, his bravery on the battlefield. But then his speech took a more personal turn. "The true measure of a person's character," the general said, his gaze sweeping over the audience, "is not how they behave in times of comfort and celebration, but how they behave in times of trial and disrespect. Last week, Dr. Marcus Hale was tested not by enemy fire, but by ignorance and arrogance. And in his response, he showed us all the true meaning of honor. He showed us that true strength lies not in retaliation, but in compassion. He showed us that dignity is not something that can be taken from you, but something you carry within you." In the back of the auditorium, standing in the shadows near the exit, were two uninvited but deeply compelled guests, Trent and Rebecca Langford. Trent had insisted they come. He had told Rebecca that they owed it to Marcus to be there, to witness the honor he so richly deserved, to face the full consequences of their actions. Rebecca, pale and thin, had agreed. She was a different woman from the one who had preened and postured at her wedding reception. The public shaming, the loss of her carefully constructed image, and the stark, terrifying reality of her near-death experience had stripped her of her pride. She wore a simple dress, no makeup, her hair pulled back in a plain ponytail. She looked small and fragile and deeply, profoundly ashamed. They watched as General Monroe called Marcus to the stage. The entire auditorium rose to its feet, erupting in a thunderous, sustained standing ovation. Marcus emerged from the wings, and a collective gasp went through the room. He was not wearing a simple suit or surgical scrubs. He was in his full military dress uniform, the same one he had worn when the general had first decorated him for his service. The uniform was immaculate, the medals on his chest gleaming under the bright lights of the television cameras. He walked with a quiet, humble confidence, his posture straight, his expression serene. He was no longer the quiet, unassuming guest. He was a pillar of strength, a national hero, a symbol of grace and integrity. As Marcus stepped onto the stage and shook the general's hand, the cameras in the room panned across the audience, capturing the tear-streaked faces, the proud smiles, the looks of profound respect. And then, for a brief fleeting moment, one of the cameras found Rebecca in the back of the room. It zoomed in on her face, capturing the single, silent tear that traced a path down her cheek. She was trembling, her eyes fixed on the man on the stage, the man she had mocked, the man who had saved her. Trent, standing beside her, did not look at the stage. He simply bowed his head, a silent personal admission of his own shame, his own failure. The narrator's voice would have then descended upon the scene, its tone deep and resonant. The same room that had once echoed with the sound of laughter at his expense now stood in unison to honor him. The woman who had told him to stay in his lane now watched as he was celebrated for rising above it all. It was a powerful public correction of a private, ugly wrong. The scene was a perfect cinematic tableau of justice, a moment of profound and undeniable vindication. The aftermath of the ceremony was as swift as it was decisive. The story, now complete with its heroic, visually stunning conclusion, became an even bigger cultural phenomenon. For Marcus and Natalie, the consequences were overwhelmingly positive. For Rebecca and her family, they were devastating. The video of Rebecca's tearful face in the auditorium, juxtaposed with Marcus's decorated uniform, went viral, becoming the final damning piece of evidence in the court of public opinion. The sponsorship deals and influencer contracts that had been the foundation of Rebecca's carefully curated lifestyle were canceled, one by one. The brands she had represented, brands that built their image on positivity and aspiration, could not afford to be associated with her. Her apology video, a stilted, carefully worded statement produced with the help of a crisis management team, was met with a flood of skepticism and derision. The public saw it not as a genuine expression of remorse, but as a desperate, self-serving attempt to salvage her shattered reputation. Her social media pages were inundated with a torrent of negative comments, forcing her to retreat from the digital world she had once so proudly dominated. Natalie, on the other hand, found her life transformed in the best possible way. Her quiet professionalism, her moral clarity, and her role in bringing the truth to light earned her widespread praise. She was hailed as a woman of integrity, a silent ally who had stood up for what was right. Her small wedding planning business was flooded with inquiries from couples who wanted to hire someone with her strong ethical compass. She was offered a position as the director of events for a major national charity, a job that came with a significant promotion and the opportunity to use her skills for a cause she believed in. She accepted the offer, and, in a move that felt both natural and right, she also joined the board of a new foundation that Marcus had established, a foundation dedicated to providing mentorship and educational opportunities for underprivileged youth. The nation embraced Marcus as a modern-day hero. He became a symbol of grace under fire, a man who had met ugliness with an unshakable sense of his own worth. He was invited to speak at conferences, at universities, at community events. He used his newfound platform not to talk about himself, but to talk about the values he embodied: respect, compassion, and the importance of looking beyond superficial labels to see the true character within. He became a powerful voice for a quieter, more dignified form of strength. The Langford family name, once a symbol of wealth and social standing, was now synonymous with arrogance and prejudice. The world had witnessed their spectacular fall from grace, a powerful reminder that wealth cannot buy character, and status is a fragile, fleeting thing. Months passed. The media frenzy eventually died down, as it always does, replaced by the next sensational story, the next viral moment. But the lessons of that night lingered, woven into the fabric of the lives it had touched. The world moved on, but it did not forget. The final scene of the story would not be in a grand ballroom or a sterile hospital, but in a humble, brightly lit community center, in a part of the city that the Langfords and their friends had never visited. The center was funded by the Dr. Marcus Hale Foundation, and its walls were covered with the vibrant, hopeful artwork of the children who spent their afternoons there. Marcus was there, not in a suit or a uniform, but in a simple pair of jeans and a sweatshirt. He was sitting at a low table, hunched over a chessboard, patiently explaining a move to a young boy whose eyes were wide with concentration. He was not Dr. Hale, the celebrated hero in this room. He was just Marcus, a mentor, a friend. A group of children surrounded him, laughing and jostling for his attention. He was in his element, his face relaxed and filled with a genuine, quiet joy. Natalie was there too, volunteering her time. She was helping a young girl with her homework, her expression as patient and kind as his. They worked in a comfortable, easy silence. Two people brought together by a strange and dramatic twist of fate, now united by a shared purpose. A television was on in the corner of the room, playing a retrospective news segment. The anchor's familiar face appeared on the screen, narrating a summary of the events that had captivated the nation. "It was a story that had it all," the anchor said, her voice filled with a practiced journalistic sincerity. "A beautiful bride, dramatic collapse, and a quiet stranger who turned out to be a hero." The screen showed a montage of images: Rebecca's sneering face, Marcus's calm expression, the flashing lights of the ambulance, the general pinning the medal on his chest. From humiliation to heroism, Dr. Marcus Hale reminded the world of a simple but powerful truth. Respect costs nothing, but its absence can cost you everything. The camera in the community center would have then zoomed in on Marcus's face as he looked up from the chessboard, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. The narrator's voice, the final, omniscient guide in this journey, would have delivered the story's closing words, its ultimate, unforgettable moral. Never judge someone by how quietly they walk into a room. Never assume you know their worth based on the clothes they wear or the color of their skin. For the world is full of quiet heroes and unassuming greatness. And one day you might find that you need the very person you mocked to be the one who saves your life. Status doesn't make you important. Character does. The person you humiliate today may be the one who saves you tomorrow. If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.